Seems we're talking about Marvel again. Sort of. However, this time, we aren't talking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe again, because I think I said more than enough about how that entire franchise has been nothing but a lost cause, with the exception of a few R-rated projects to look forward to. This time we're talking about Sony and their strange attempt to make a cinematic universe that connects to the MCU, but also doesn't? It's complicated. To explain all of this, we have to start from the very beginning. So in the late 90s, Marvel was filing for bankruptcy and sold a fair amount of their characters' film rights to other studios. Look, you already know what happened if you watch my MCU video or any other video that discussed the history of Marvel as a company. However, there is one important detail in this instance. Marvel had sold Spider-Man's film rights to Sony in the 90s, and later had begun working on the first movie. Initially, said movie was to be directed by James Cameron and was, different and more adult than what the currently released movie would become. What the actual fuck? Eventually, the film we actually got was directed by Sam Raimi. The movie had a budget of $139 million and had grossed over $825 million worldwide. Clearly, the Raimi Spider-Man series was a giant success for Sony. In 2007, Spider-Man 3 came out, and while it is a cult classic now, the movie was initially given to mixed reviews from critics and audiences. Some felt the silliness and idiocy had gone too off the rails and the plot was messy. However, the film still made over $895 million, and was the highest grossing Spider-Man movie until 2019. Spider-Man 3's success allowed for a sequel to be greenlit. However, Raimi had pretty much zero faith in the project and left it to die. Sony either had to reboot the series or work with Marvel. And considering that Sony at this point would rather jump headfirst into an incinerator before working with Marvel, the Amazing Spider-Man movies were conceived and eventually released. You already know how this goes. The first movie was fine, but did well enough to greenlight a sequel, then was seen as catastrophically bad. Once again, people thought that this film was too messy like Spider-Man 3 was, but this is where the problem really starts. So Amazing Spider-Man 2 was actually meant to set up two sequels, a Sinister Six film, and several other Spider-Man spin-offs for a Sony Cinematic Universe. Clearly, they were trying to bite off the hype and success of Marvel Studios' own cinematic universe. So what went wrong? Well, the first problem was that Amazing Spider-Man 2's messiness, at least part of it, was it constantly trying to set up this cinematic universe with Easter eggs and random Spider-Man characters showing up because reference. They had basically shot themselves in the foot in trying to cram too much into one film for its own plot, but also had tried to tie in a bunch of random threads for a cinematic universe in a way that was so overly ambitious that it ended up imploding on itself. Them wanting a cinematic universe wasn't technically a bad idea back then. It was clearly very lucrative and ambitious, but it seems they bit off way more than they can chew. Unfortunately, many months after Amazing Spider-Man 2 was released in 2014, Sony had received a massive hack. The hackers had leaked confidential information regarding Sony's projects and the details of Sony's employees. You really see how history repeats. Because of this hack, Sony had to work with Marvel again, but under a strange condition. Said condition was to work with Marvel on Tom Holland's current Spider-Man films, while they had their own cinematic universe that could potentially take place within the MCU. We'll talk about how poorly communicated that is later. Around early 2017, Sony had announced a solo Venom film slated to be released in late 2018. By 2018, it had been released to mixed reviews. The important part of this movie was that it made money. It made a shit ton of money. Clearly, Sony saw that this movie was very profitable and their cinematic universe idea was broadly expanded upon. This pushed them to make a Venom sequel pretty much immediately after that post-credits scene, and it was initially slated to release in late 2020 after Morbius was slated to release around mid-2020-ish. Unfortunately, COVID happened and it delayed both of these movies by full years. Venom Let There Be Carnage eventually came out and made money close to the first, but Morbius was a stranger case. A lot of people didn't know who the hell Morbius was/is, so of course, Sony didn't exactly have that pull with that movie. The sad part is that Morbius was a financial flop twice somehow. People basically memed the hell out of the movie out of pity for it, which tricked Sony into thinking it was such a good film that they had to release this twice. This underrated classic, oh my god. To their hilariously unwarranted shock, this didn't work in trying to pull new people to seeing it. Let There Be Carnage and Morbius were the first real sign of how shaky this weird attempt at a shared universe was. We'll get into how so later, but keep in mind how all over the place it is. After those movies were released, we got the confirmations for Kraven and Madam Web, which both had rapidly floundered and flipping and flopping between release schedules so many times before the writer's strike happened last summer, which delayed both of them to 2024. The most recent movie in this Sony Venomverse thing is Madam Web, and boy is it a masterpiece. We'll get into how very shortly. Right now, it is absolutely struggling at the box office, showing how this universe idea is doing so horribly. And Sony does not know what the hell they're doing. Like Morbius, it's using a Spider-Man character that only people in the Spider-Man media circle really know, and the box office reflects that. So like with the MCU video, I'm basically gonna give my own personal thoughts on all of these Sony Venomverse movies. It won't take as long though, because none of these movies are all that good. And there are only 4 of them, so we'll start with Venom, I guess. So Venom is a really interesting movie for me. I was about 13 when the movie came out, yet I still found it fluctuating between hilariously ridiculous and utterly boring. The first Venom movie is a mediocre superhero movie that would only really be entertaining while watching with friends. While drunk. Venom as a movie has a lot of problems with its story. The biggest one of them is pacing. The movie for some reason drags for so long, telling you over showing the most shallow presentation of who Eddie Brock is and how he became broke, and it's so boring. No character that he interacts with is interesting either, and he's not interesting. It's not until Eddie bonds with the symbiote almost an hour into the movie that the movie is anywhere near engaging. While yes, there are unintentionally funny moments within the movie, what's going on isn't engaging in the slightest. When Venom shows up, this movie basically becomes an unintentional comedy. I do emphasize that it is unintentionally funny, because the actual jokes are pretty bland, but it's in the moments where the movie doesn't want you to take it as a joke, where the movie really wants you to take it seriously, that are absolutely hysterical. Besides being unintentionally funny, this movie is honestly really bland when there isn't something stupid going on. Some boring jokes here, some generic CGI fights there. I think another big issue with the movie is the characterization of Venom. Venom's sense of humor from things like Lethal Protector comics and the PS1 game are largely intact, but I'm talking about his relationship with Eddie. While I do like the old married couple dynamic that Eddie and the symbiote have, the problem is that the symbiote is more entertaining than Eddie. Like I said before, Eddie is largely bland and often feels like he takes a bit of a backseat to everything going on, even if he's literally involved. I especially don't like this one specific issue with his origin story that has been cropping up in a lot of new Venom media. My problem boils down to either a lack of Spider-Man or making the suit Venom instead of Venom being a combination of the host and the suit. In this Venomverse, they decided to not have Spider-Man be in the story, which sucks more than most would think. My big issue with this is that Venom being the suit completely destroys the entire reason that he and Eddie Brock say, "We are Venom." In every other adaptation, when Peter ditches the symbiote and the symbiote latches onto Brock, they both share a bond over their mutual hatred for Spider-Man and Peter Parker. They call themselves Venom because their hatred is poisonous to Peter and Spider-Man, which makes them Venom.
From now on, we're poison to you, Spider-Man. That's why we call ourselves Venom.
From now on, we're poison to Peter Parker and Spider-Man. We're Venom!
Even the newest game fucked this up by not having Eddie be the host, but at least in that story it had Spider-Man in it. These movies basically make it so that the symbiote is Venom instead of the combination of the two's hatred for Spider-Man, because Spider-Man does not exist in this universe. If they really didn't want to have Spider-Man exist, a fun way they could have done this is by having the symbiote be nameless until the end of the movie, where they say, "We are Venom." And it at least feigned some character progression and mystery. Something I also don't like is how safe this movie is with Venom's brutality and him being an anti-hero. I'm aware that Lethal Protector exists, but that story exists because of Venom's long redemption arc. This movie barely even makes him an anti-hero besides showing him killing other characters sometimes. What I mean is that he's just sort of a generic good guy that stops evil because he's a hero in this one. I have an issue with this because the marketing for the movie before it came out implied that this wouldn't really be a superhero film, but rather an anti-hero movie starring a character that doesn't care about all those altruistic, heroic moral values and does the right thing his way. Seems a bit misleading, I'd say. Also, this movie is PG-13, which is stupid that this is a live-action Venom movie where he bites people's heads. The big issue with the PG-13 rating is that it doesn't really feel that much of a PG-13 movie either, until you hear a character swear or something.
Oh, fuck it.
Even as a PG-13 Venom movie, this feels neutered, and it's stupid that Kraven gets an R-rated movie when a character like Venom won't. The other characters that aren't Eddie or Venom are giant charisma voids. They aren't technically all that bad, but I don't think I'd remember most of them beyond just sort of being their set dressing. They don't contribute that much, and I barely even remember their names. I think the worst character here is Carlton Drake as Riot. Comic inaccurate host aside, he's just a bland scientist villain and wants to take over the world or something. He's so boring and only really exists for Venom to fight something in the climax. Speaking of fighting things, if I can say anything entertaining about the movie, it's the action scenes that are actually pretty okay. There are shockingly few, but all of them before the final fight are pretty good. The issue is that the final fight is an incomprehensible CGI sludge fest, which makes it so mind-numbingly uninteresting and boring. It's also hard to tell which symbiote is which because they're so similarly colored in this gray, boring-looking arena that the fight is just a miasma of boring goo monster clashing. Venom as a movie overall is somewhat bland at its core, but is also unintentionally hilarious and stupid. I appreciate its commitment to tapping into the zany stories and humor of Venom comics, but it's ultimately generic and forgettable. It has some cool scenes, but it clearly just exists to set up sequels. Speaking of which, with a tease for Carnage in the post-credit scene for the first film, of course a sequel would go underway. Despite being a shorter film, this film feels like it's the one they actually wanted to make, since it was way too early to do Carnage that last time. The thing about this movie is that I would call it better than the last movie, but it still has so many flaws. First off, the silly and ridiculous tone seems to be doubled down on here, which makes it better and worse at the same time. It's better because it shows how self-aware they are, but it's also worse because them being in on the joke sort of makes it more unfunny. This movie has more intentional comedy than the last movie, where it makes me feel that the writers think they're funnier than they actually are. It may just be personal preference, but even in being an unintended comedic gem, this movie somewhat fails because of the fact that it's not actually unintended and is just purposefully stupid. Nothing exactly wrong with that, but part of what made the original Venom funnier was the fact that it wasn't intended. I guess I enjoyed it less than a lot of people, but I do agree that it is still pretty ridiculous to the point of making me laugh. The rest of the movie is just sort of whatever in my opinion. I think it has the opposite problem as the first movie, where that one felt like it dragged its feet for the first act and a half, then rapidly picks up after Venom is introduced. This one just goes full speed ahead and lands at around an hour and a half. It's about as long as an early Pixar movie, which I guess makes it an easier time, but it sort of makes the movie feel more vapid and shallow, which is especially apparent with the characters. Once again, the side characters are useless, but they're worse. Even the Michelle Williams love interest from the first movie is just demoted to being a damsel in distress now. Other characters are so forgettable and unentertaining that I completely forget they even exist. I will say that the idea that Venom and Eddie are getting fed up with each other is interesting, in concept. The sad part is that Eddie feels like he takes a backseat in this series, and it makes it feel hollow. Despite the back and forth between Eddie and the symbiote being pretty entertaining, Eddie himself is just a shallow character on his own, and he has no personality besides the joke of, haha, he looks like he's talking to himself. If I'm being honest, a pretty disappointing part of this movie is Carnage. He felt incredibly wasted in this movie, which makes the short runtime sting even more. I think Woody Harrelson does a great job of playing him, but there's one thing I feel ruins this version of the character, and it's the fact that Carnage is independent from Cletus Cassidy. So basically, with every other version of Carnage, he's the opposite of Venom and other symbiotes. So in the comics, Eddie went to prison and the symbiote rebonded with Eddie and it asexually reproduces. There's another symbiote waiting to bond with Cletus, and said symbiote bonds with a bloody cut on his body, which symbolizes how much more of a perfect fusion Cletus and the symbiote have. Carnage doesn't say we like Venom does. He says I because they are a perfect fusion. What makes Carnage a dangerous character outside of just being plainly psychotic is the fact that the psychosis is mixed with the fact that Cletus is bonded with an all-powerful Goom alien. It all made him scarier to be one guy doing all of this. Eddie's rage towards Spider-Man was gaslit and inflamed by the symbiote, but Cletus was already a psycho, and Carnage is basically his final form. In this movie, they're two separate entities like Venom and Eddie. The reason this is so bad is because it removes how unique Carnage was from Venom and all the other symbiotes. And it also allows for a dumb scene where Cletus argues against the Carnage symbiote, which is just so not Carnage. It may seem like a fanboy inaccuracy nitpick, but it's just a detail that makes Carnage who he is as a character. And this movie tramples on that in favor of just wasting him on a big CGI fight like with Riot. I'll give the movie that at least the action is far better. I think the final battle is especially largely improved from the unintelligible drivel from that last movie. Carnage being a different color and being more noticeably different might actually be a contributing factor to why this final fight is a lot better. Overall, Let There Be Carnage is a fun enough movie that I would definitely liked a lot more than the first, but it feels empty. That hour and a half runtime is kind of a double-edged sword. It's watchable, but at the same time, it's not exactly a very fulfilling watch. movie's existence is absolutely sad. Morbius is bad, but it's so empty that I can assume all of the memes existed out of pity. From day one, clearly no one cared about this movie because it just seemed to evoke a bunch of 2000 superhero movies. The only eye-catching thing about Morbius was how it could connect to Spider-Man, but that was literally only in trailers to mislead people. And even the director didn't understand why that shit was there. So to actually talk about the movie for real without the memes, it's shit. Morbius is so hilariously anemic and boring, which obviously makes it an unengaging watch. Like I said before, this movie is weirdly evocative of 2000 superhero movies like Daredevil, Elektra, or Catwoman. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the way it's shot and lit, or the weird abundance of cliches that this film loves to use, which were popular in these older movies. I don't know. Even without that, this movie is so ostensibly boring. The acting is mostly bored people that sound bored. If that's a vague description, that's because it's literally the only way to describe it. Nearly every actor gives their line in a way that makes them seem like they don't want to be there, and I honestly can't blame them at all. Matt Smith is pretty much the only one who seems like he's having fun throughout. He's the only standout character in this entire movie. He has zero depth beyond him being friends with the Morbius, but the acting is just hilarious. My issue with Matt Smith's character is that he's literally Morbius, but evil. That already makes me feel stupid to say when Morbius is a Spider-Man villain and a Blade villain, but whatever. Different universe. Just like the first Venom, it makes the final battle a pile of CGI noise, but it's worse because instead of different colored goo, it's a speed trail that obscures the actor. There's a generic love interest too, I guess. She has no personality outside of she wants to fuck Morbius. I'm pretty sure she dies in this movie, I don't remember, and I just watched this shit days ago as of recording. The post-credit scene is actually hilarious in this movie, and is in relation to something I wanted to get into. So basically, if you remember the post-credit scene from Venom 2, you'd know that it's confirmation that Sony seemingly went back on these films taking place in the MCU, and that movie sets up a rivalry between Venom and Spider-Man for some reason, even though it's fucking stupid. No Way Home's ending happened, so of course none of it could come to fruition, but then Morbius decides to allow Doctor Strange's spell to malfunction and bring in Michael Keaton's Vulture in for a scene that was so clearly last minute and has dialogue as competent as an 8-year-old me playing with action figures. Not to mention that the dialogue doesn't make any goddamn sense either because they want to team up to set up a Sinister Six movie, but with no Spider-Man. Holy shit, guys, just decanonize this movie and spare yourself of any creative burnout. This movie is clearly just evident of the clear lack of communication between Sony and Marvel. It seems like Marvel wants to do their own stuff with their own universe and their own Spider-Man, while Sony wants to shove their own cinematic universe idea in somehow. It makes it feel so hilariously disconnected from its initial setup as potentially being within the main world of the MCU, but then spinning out of control because Marvel clearly wants to do their own thing. All of this is to say that Morbius was a giant waste of money and time for everyone, in both watching and making. So as I'm writing this, I just saw this movie a few weeks ago, and jokes about empty theaters aside, this movie is a complete train wreck. I would say this movie is worse than Morbius, but it also has more problems that are so bad they're hilarious. Honestly, this movie is more of a so bad it's funny type. At least a lot more than I thought it would.
He was in the Amazon with my mom when she was researching spiders right before she died.
First off, the acting is even worse than Morbius somehow. In Morbius it was bad because of how bland the line delivery was, but here the blandness is weirdly funnier? It's hard to explain, but the acting is funnier than Morbius. There's also very bad and noticeable ADR in this. All Sony movies have automatic dialogue replacement, but because of the delays in reshoots, this one is way more noticeable. The main villain especially has this problem because they try to cover up the reshoots in ADR with this shitty Party City ass spider suit. It just reminds me of how William Fichtner was gonna be Shredder before they reshot that part of the movie and poorly covered up those scenes of Fichtner being in the armor with bad ADR from another actor. It's a mess. The CGI in this movie is dog shit once again, but it's weird here since there's barely any action. The editing is also absolutely atrocious here, whether it's in action scenes or even just characters talking. For some reason, the action scenes especially have this weird issue of quick cutting, and it makes it so clear that this movie was stitched together after the reshoots. These quick cuts are way worse than MCU bad. They're, if anything, more like late Michael Bay Transformers bad. Oh right, the three girls exist and have zero personality. I couldn't care less about these characters at all. They seem somewhat shoehorned in for the sake of getting people in seats because they'll be spider people. Someday. There's a Spider-Woman action sequence and a vision from the main villain, and there's one in the end, which is also just a vision. The reason this sucks is because it's literally a giant ripoff. The advertising was geared towards these Spider-Women that have never been adapted. Also, their costumes look like dollar store cosplay garbage. The main characters overall are so boring and flavorless, and their chemistry is just non-existent. Every character feels completely disconnected from each other when interacting, and I can't buy that any of them are close in any sense. Not to mention that the bad acting makes this so much worse. Cassandra Webb's origin story is stupid beyond just being inaccurate. So, in the comics and other adaptations, Madam Web is a guide character for Spider-Man sometimes, and also oversees the Web of Destiny. She was born blind and everything else, and she sits in a chair and guides. She's like a Palutena or an Aku Aku for Spider-Man. This movie tries to have her become blind in the dumbest and most hilarious way possible. A stray firework. Fucking firework, oh my god. Yeah, sometimes don't take liberties from the source material. He's also just really bland, which again isn't helped by the hilariously bored acting. The actual worst character in this movie was Ezekiel Sims. Shitty ADR covered by his spider suit aside, as a villain, he's so bafflingly shallow and incompetent. People talk about hero characters getting nerfed to service villains, but I think villain characters that get completely bitched to service the heroes are worse. A villain like this, who has been on killing 3 girls before they can kill him, should be intimidating. But Sims is just there to get hit by cars for some reason. Making heroes make mistakes to service a villain is way more engaging than a villain that just sort of flops around. When he's not getting bitched by cars somehow, he's just boring. His motivation, like I said, is him wanting to kill all 3 of these girls before they grow up to be spider people and kill him. I guess that's a fine motive in a vacuum, but the way he carries himself throughout the movie is just, once again, boring. So basically he fucks some computer nerd and she can just access cameras to the entire world, and all he does is generic villain shit like walking and either tell this woman that she's not doing a good job when she's trying, or lamenting about how he wants to kill the 3 girls. He's just boring, he has no personality, and once again, goes out like a bitch. Also, Peter Parker's mom and Uncle Ben are in this, but clearly serve zero purpose other than A, allowing for scenes that make no sense, and B, stupid hollow key jangling fan service for Spider-Man fans. Their dialogue is also really bad in this movie for some reason, despite being played by really good actors. So there's this one scene. Mary Parker is pregnant with Peter in this movie, and her water breaks. And Ben's like, oh, that's not supposed to happen for another few weeks. And then Mary's like, I guess the baby didn't get the memo. Peter Parker being born in this movie has nothing to do with the plot anyway. I don't even think that many Spider-Man fans give a damn about how he was born. They just want to see Spider-Man. Despite fans of any media caring about lore sometimes, most don't want to see random lore dumps that can be easily retconned. I don't care how Peter was literally born. I care to see him be Spider-Man. If you want to see Mary pregnant, do a flashback in some other Spider-Man project. I think that part somewhat also shows that the movie was intended to be far different from what it was attempted in the final product. From what I can tell, somehow, Peter Parker was going to tie into the main narrative. But for whatever reason, they just shoved in these 3 girls that are also Spider-Women in the comics, only for them to never suit up until the future. Well, clearly no one wants to see a future with these characters, so that's not happening. Overall, Madam Web is probably the worst of Sony's Spider-Man universe. There's nothing here but laughably bad filmmaking decisions, boring acting, and characters that have zero charisma or personality. All this movie exists for is just to set up a confused cinematic universe that was already dead on arrival. Clearly, this universe was already screwed from the very start. All of it was built from 10 years of Sony's weird want to make solo movies of Spider-Man characters that make no sense to exist in most cases. A lot of this comes from this really weird mentality that I've seen in a lot of big-budget Western media for some reason, where they feel like every single character with some significant role needs to have some sort of spin-off of sorts. For some characters, this makes sense to do. Sometimes it can actually work, but it has to make sense for it to exist. What this Sony cinematic universe of Spider-Man characters doesn't realize is that most of these characters either don't need a movie or only work as Spider-Man villains and side characters. What I hate most about movies like Madam Web or Morbius is that since they are about obscure characters that only the ones in the Spider-Man circle know, the movies are first impressions for general audiences. 90% of people who these movies are geared towards have never read the comics. They likely didn't grow up with nor remember a lot of 90s Spider-Man cartoon characters or even other Spider-Man cartoons. They probably didn't even play the older video games either. Even if in some alternate timeline, Venom was a movie with the worst review scores, it wouldn't matter because unlike Morbius and Madam Web, he's basically the most popular Spider-Man character. Two Venom movies that aren't very good and have mixed reviews does not change the reputation of that character, because he's iconic. Madam Web and Morbius are usually done in one-off arcs in comics and cartoons, so of course if new audiences don't know them, no one will go out to see them, even if they're connected to Spider-Man. Considering that Insomniac's Spider-Man 2 is still fairly recent, I'm sure even if the Craven movie is bad, he'll be fine. People liked him in Spider-Man 2, so he'll be fine if his first impression to general audiences was great or not. Even if that movie gets a 1 out of 10 on IMDb and a 0% tomato meter score, Craven won't be seen as a shit character to be memed on. Marvel and Sony also can't seem to properly communicate as to what each wants with these characters. Sony wants to do crossovers and the MCU crew just wants to do their own thing with them. Constantly, it seems as if they can't agree on anything, or just aren't talking at all. If it continues, we'll likely see more laughable ideas from Sony, more solo films that no one asked for, more solo films that don't even make a lick of sense to exist. They'd probably actually pitch a movie about the Wall or Big Wheel at this point. Sony's cinematic universe was a bad idea from the get-go, and it sucks that people are being introduced to these characters that are popular among Spider-Man fans in a way that's as disrespectfully laughable as this. They may as well just throw this idea away, since in the 5.5 years since Venom started, it's basically gone nowhere. All there is to say now is just make a goddamn Spider-Man movie. So I've taken so much time off recently due to a lot of random nonsense going on in my personal life, and I've wanted to make videos, but time is a mistress that doesn't love me, so I haven't been able to at all. However, ideas shall keep on flowing. I mean, as I'm recording this, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has already come out, Rise of the Ronin is on track to release in a few days from now, and I mean, I'm looking to cover more movie and show related stuff, and thankfully Netflix graced us with the worst adaptation of all time now, so I'll get to that script eventually. And goddammit, I'm still trying to debate as to whether I want to make a video on Persona 3 Reload or not.